light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Hu. A difficult, complex topic, but I don't know if there's any topic that I won't talk about on my show, because to me, everything that you can name needs to be discussed and understood in greater depth. And there's distinctions to be made between what has integrity and what doesn't, and what is true and what is false. And of course, from the different perspectives, it won't always be the same thing. Some things look true from one perspective, but not another. Kind of like when I was in high school, and one of the books we were required to read was All Quiet on the Western Front, which essentially looks at the war, World War II, from the other side, from a German perspective. And I guess the thing, well, it brings me back to that witticism about war, that it doesn't determine who's right, only who's left. In finding ways to look across the divide, though, and say, well, what does it look like from the other side? And why would they make that conclusion? And why would they see it that way? And is there some common problem that we haven't addressed that is responsible for things being interpreted that way? There are a great many problems that happen with the United States, I think, that are due to the United States having such appallingly poor systems that adequately address, or that don't to address, because they don't adequately address issues of mental health. And so, as I mentioned to someone recently, considering how many people have horrible stories of what happened in childhood, it may be amazing that any of us ever survive our childhoods, but somehow we make it to adulthood, and then we get to try to sift it all out and figure out what is my opinion on this going to be? And how do I do better than the generations before me? And how do I become myself and not just a reflection of all the bad things that have ever been done to me? With those sorts of ideas in mind, one of the topics that I brought up within my doctoral writing that I don't think is given near enough attention is the arena, if you will, or the spectrum, perhaps, of religious abuse. On one hand, we have the blatant hypocrites who are forever asking for exorbitant amounts of money from their congregation in order to continue the ministry they're doing and all this, and then they are spending it narcissistically on themselves with such lavish lifestyles that it makes no sense that poor people are sending them money. That the person who is going hungry or who has inadequate housing is still sending a certain amount of money each month, each week, whatever time it is, to a minister who is riding around in a Rolls Royce, living in a 10,000 square foot mansion and flying on a private plane every time he travels. It makes no sense. It's, if you truly believe, if the minister, he or she, or they truly believed in the gospel they were preaching, it would seem to infer a reasonable amount of modesty and humility, because the money should not go to their own excess life experience, but instead going to help the poor and the needy and the homeless and those who need medical care and can't afford it, those who would pursue educational opportunities if they could find the funding for their education, those who need job retraining and can't find that or can't afford that. Any number of things that I've commented in a few episodes, I guess now, that as someone in graduate level education, coming close to the conclusion of my doctoral degree, I'm forever running into academics who profess to be concerned about social justice issues. And I always kind of roll my eyes, because my first question after that is, what are you doing to address economic disparity? Because if they aren't doing anything to address economic disparity, I don't believe them, that they're really concerned about social justice issues, because there is not a single social justice issue that is not tied to economic disparity. I've looked, it's not there. If we want to address, if we're serious about addressing social justice, social justice issues, we need to be involved in addressing economic disparity. Until everyone has enough, the social justice issues will continue. The narcissism and the greed and the things that unbalance and create disparity and create suffering and problems all of our planet, literally. In the midst of all that, you have a certain professional body of clergy of all different religions who ideally are serving the personal and spiritual growth and communal growth and the ethical and moral health of their communities and of the individuals within their communities. In amongst the good ones, the men and women who are genuinely doing their job well, the clergy who are genuinely trustworthy and non-judgmental and advancing personal and spiritual growth in a wide variety of different theological modes or mediums. In amongst all of that is a significant number, hopefully not a high percentage, but a significant number who engage in what I term religious abuse, asking people to live according to a theology, for example, that doesn't answer their needs and that doesn't correspond with their lives. That a theology that says, women be subservient to your husbands. Well, does that apply to domestic violence situations in which the husband may be an abuser? Does that apply to a situation in which the wife may be an alcoholic and bringing all the problems of alcoholism into the family? How does a husband in that situation come to terms with this traditional view that the husband is supposed to be head of the household, but he doesn't have the first clue how to address the violence that comes from his wife's alcoholism? Or is it a teenager who's acting out because they have emotional and psychological needs that haven't been adequately met, and the parents are supposed to be good parents, but they don't know how to deal with the emotional and psychological needs that their teenager is experiencing? To what extent can we take our theological principles and paste them over the top of that without ever looking at what's really going on? That kind of denial, that kind of disconnect that isn't based on solid information about the situation, that I would consider a form of religious abuse. That a clergy person will want to say, this is what our sacred text says you should do in this situation. But the clergy person doesn't have all the details of the case, and the sacred text that they're quoting wasn't written to deal with those kinds of sociological problems. The sociological context of the sacred texts that are in existence, in many cases, might mention a sociological problem, but the whole science of psychology wasn't even invented until the 19th century. We didn't come to that kind of multidimensional understanding of ourselves until very recently. And then in the midst of all that, we get to throw in the other wild card of discovering orientation, that it really is orientation. It's not a psychological problem, it really is orientation. There are people who are gay, people who are lesbian, people who are bisexual, people who are transgender, and everything in between. 50 years ago, psychological science, medical science, even clergy had no way of recognizing or understanding those sorts of new, I hesitate to say classifications, those new ways of defining what humanity is and how much diversity humanity includes. And so because they didn't know, they try to repress it. It can't be right. It's not in our Bible. It's not in our Quran. It's not in our book. Whatever text one is using, it's not there. And surely, because it is a sacred text, everything we need to know must be in there, or not. The sacred text did the best they could and gave the best wisdom they could. But they cannot be the final word on anything, because time is still going on. Time is still unfolding. Time is still continuing. And humanity is still learning more things than were ever known at the time those sacred texts were written. To have been written as a text for all time would have been to claim a timelessness that I'm not sure any human language is able to encompass. Every language by its very nature is contextual in time and in place, and languages by their very nature evolve. The way people spoke English 100 years ago is not the way people speak English now. The way people spoke any other language on earth you can name is not identical to what it was 500 years ago. There are languages that evolve into other languages, and languages that split into all sorts of different dialects. It used to be French was what they spoke in France, but now you have French, the French-Canadian dialect, you have Luxembourg, you have what's happened in all the different colonies. There isn't one French language anymore. And then, of course, even in France, you have Parisian French and the French of the outlying cities and towns all throughout the country of France. So language splits in a million different directions, and theology splits in a million different directions. The number of things that go under the heading of Christianity are so broad, it seems almost laughable to call them one religion, extending everything from Eastern Orthodox to snake-handling Pentecostal religions in the Appalachian Mountains. And all of this theoretically comes from multiple languages actually, but even if you take only the Christian sources that derive from English languages, you still have so much diversity that even within one congregation you can't get agreement on virtually any topic. You can create an argument anywhere. Going back to this topic of religious abuse though, in one of my previous shows, I commented, because I've had a number of people contact me who describe themselves as atheists, and I'm not here to tell them what to believe or what not to believe. They have to make those choices for themselves. But it does raise the question of what does atheism mean in the dictionary definition, in each of their experience, and in practice, what does it mean? Because it could mean a number of different things. If what atheism means is that the divine is not what the church said, I'll agree with that. But I don't consider myself an atheist because I do believe that there is something that is divine, but for me the definition stops at the spiritual embodiment of highest wisdom and greatest love. Because beyond that, I find the divine wrapped in mystery. And consequently, that's why when I was ordained, I chose to identify as an interfaith minister. And so I work with people of any belief system or none. But what I've said in a previous episode is that I don't think people who have not had an experience of God, as it's often termed, should pretend that they have. And I don't think people who have had an experience of God should act as if they haven't. I mean, that's a psychological disconnect, that essentially a psychologist who tries to tell someone who has had an experience of God that they didn't have that experience, it didn't happen, it's not real, you're making this up, and yet inside their mind, this person thinks, but I know what I saw, and I know what I felt, and I know how it unfolded, and I may not have an explanation for it, but trying to tell myself that nothing happened sets up a psychological incongruity that steers them in the direction of mental dysfunction rather than mental health. And so, to me, it would be religious abuse to tell someone you have to act like you've had an experience that you didn't have. And it would be just as much of religious abuse to tell an atheist, you have to act like you've had an experience that you didn't have. And if someone has had an experience, to allow it to be surrounded by mystery, and to allow it to be something that unfolds over time. And maybe they will never fully understand what they perceived or what they experienced, but they should not for that reason be told to deny that it happened. They experienced something, they saw something, maybe they just need to sit with it for a while and wait. And maybe in time it'll make sense, but maybe it doesn't make sense at the time it happened. That applies to so many things in life, where we're there, we go through it, we write it all down, and 20 years later when we reflect on it, we realize something that we didn't realize at the time. Religious abuse demands conformity and says you have to fit the mold. At one time in my teenage years, I attended a Pentecostal church, and it was challenging and kind of unnerving in a way to watch how the different members of the congregation responded to the different inexplicable events that would happen within various services, and how they would try to imitate those who were acting a particular way because that person was considered to be very holy and very spiritual and was admired by everybody, so I should be like them, right? And Sister Hu, of course, would say, no, you should be like yourself. They're being who they are, you should be like yourself. And if you have an experience or if you don't, it doesn't mean that you're better or worse, that you're more spiritual or less. It just means you're having your own life and your own spiritual experience. And if your spiritual experience is no more involved than sitting and meditating and focusing on a particular piece of sacred text, and as you sit there and ponder it and ponder it and ponder it, after about 10 minutes, you suddenly realize something that you never realized before. And if no one else ever realizes the same conclusion, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with yours. Your conclusion was your conclusion. Maybe you see a falseness, maybe you see a truth, maybe you see yourself in ways that you never saw yourself before. The religious health to me is having the honesty and the integrity to own your own experience and not to pretend someone else's, and not to have anyone else attack you for not having their experience, for not being more like them, for not conforming to their definition of normal. Whether in a church or out of a church. In a church, that would be religious abuse. Outside of a church, I suppose it would be mental abuse. That you're expected to be something you're not in order to satisfy the people around you, not because it feels true to you. Part of coming to this place of mental and spiritual and emotional health, though, is recognizing that we're not in this world all alone. The world is a shared space, and that means that we have to collaborate and respect and dialogue with people who have had experiences very different from our own. Religious abuse, in all the examples I can think of, has no tolerance for that kind of diversity. And yet the amusing, ironic thing, and the reason I'm smiling as I say that is because as Sister Hu, I would say religious and spiritual diversity was not an idea concocted by any human theologian. So I have to wonder if it wasn't concocted by God. If God was the one who created the diversity, on a mischievous note, I suppose I would ask, I would suggest, maybe the reason God created so much spiritual diversity is just to put all the theologians to the test and give them something to argue about forever. To keep them busy with their arguments so that the rest of us can go on and create an individual, unique spirituality that we find genuinely empowering. Something to think about. I hope some of the things I've shared do inspire some empowering and productive thoughts for you, regardless whether you have any belief system or none, that you find ways to develop and empower the non-physical parts of yourself. Thank you very much for watching. I went to the garden when the day was yet new. The weeds had grown up and hid flowers from view. The mountain above me hid the light of the sun, as the cycle of life all around me did run. Stones into earth, broken down by time, earth into flowers that upward climb, flowers into seeds blown away in rhyme, to the stones into earth broken down by time. So often unnoticed and not given a care, I could quickly forget that they even are there, shuffling along on a road all my own, through unending changes and encounters unknown. Stones into earth, broken down by time, earth into flowers that upward climb, flowers into seeds blown away in rhyme, to the stones into earth broken down by time. The strangers I meet may be friends or foes, sharing our joys and grieving our woes. Difference is real, yet superficial at best. Each moment of life puts our souls to the test. Stones into earth, broken down by time, earth into flowers that upward climb, flowers into seeds blown away in rhyme, to the stones into earth broken down by time. Like a great turning wheel breaking down to renew, some things must depart as others come into view. The end of the day puts the stars in the sky, and journeying on, I don't need to know why. Stones into earth, broken down by time, earth into flowers that upward climb, flowers into seeds blown away in rhyme, to the stones into earth broken down by time.